Good evening.
Good evening.
So our topic this evening, carrying on these Vision Days, which is really fun this summer, is our building as a space resource to the community. So we've had some conversation about where we're going to go with this evening. And as I was thinking about a Bible verse that would fit this topic, was a bit of a challenge, but I came across one that I think actually speaks really well to it. And this is from the NIV translation from 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 10. Each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms.
Got a very unrelated question, but I think the congregation will be very interested to know. So how did you end up with the NIV? Is it just because that's the Bible that you had at the time, or were you looking for something?
No, I was actually looking for the verse, and when I tried to find it in my Bible to bring up this evening, I couldn't find it. The words were different. So I did a search and discovered it was a different translation, but I thought I love the wording of that, and it fits, so I'm going to stay with it.
Yeah, and so the reason I wanted to touch on it is we talk about all the different translations, and you seek to be as faithful to the original language as possible, but we know that those words sometimes can be translated into different words in English. And so it is interesting and important sometimes to go to different versions. We typically use the New Revised Standard version,
Right.
NRSV, in worship, but the New International Version is a very good version too. And there are, I believe, ELCA colleges and maybe even seminaries that also use the NIV.
Well, I just think it's fascinating how sometimes it's just a turn of phrase that will catch your attention in a whole different way by looking at a different translation.
Yep. But then, with that said, it's again, this is a super side note to what we're talking about. But it's also important to know that some aren't translations, though.
Right.
They're paraphrases. And so, like, if you're looking at a Living Translation or New Living Translation or the old Good News.
Or the Message.
Yep. And then I was going to say the newer one is the Message, which seeks to make it more readable rather than being so stuck to actually translating each word for word.
Right.
So,
right. So what I liked about that was whatever gift you have received to serve others. And I thought about this beautiful sanctuary in this building and how this came to be in, was it 1929? I know you've got the history. 1929, when this building was first
dug
raised.
With horses and people.
Yeah, incredible. And so we stand on the shoulders of all those forefathers and foremothers who went before us, and they had their vision of what this church building would be, how it would serve the community and serve as a church home for so many people in the area.
Yeah.
And that vision has remained the same in terms of being a place to express the gospel of Jesus Christ. And yet the vision of how this building itself is used as a resource in the community and to help serve the community has continued to evolve and change as the decades have gone on.
Yeah, and so express the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's the message in the building. But the building itself and our use of it can express the love of Jesus Christ.
Yes.
To our neighbors.
Yes.
To the community.
And so our task is to think of ourselves always as stewards of this place, that we don't own it in the same way that we own our homes or a business, but that we are stewards and caretakers of this space and this building and all that it contains to best reach out and serve others in the community.
Yeah. So then I was tasked in kind of looking at church buildings as a community center kind of throughout the generations, because, the Christian church started in homes.
Right.
So it was home churches. It wasn't a separate structure from our home, but that was very strong during kind of the medieval times.
And we kind of went back to a little bit this year.
Yeah, our home churches were.
Yes.
Yeah, but no, but the church building as a separate entity during that 1000 to 1300 time frame, where much of life and faith, where it was kind of all connected. Every community had a church, and if the community was large enough, it had a cathedral, a very, very large church. But if you think about the world, and we talked about this a little earlier, the world at that time and what a village was, it often was, homes, so residential, and it had, if not a bunch else, it had a church.
Right.
And that church was this kind of in the center with the spindle wheel roads coming off that center of those old European towns. And out front of that church was what they called the town square. And it's just kind of fascinating to think about that, the church was the hub
Right.
of that community. Nowadays, we're so used to every business having its own building. At that time, that wasn't the case unless you were in a big city. But even there, the biggest building was the cathedral in the center of town, and this town square. And it talked about how even at that point, with that church being kind of the center of the town, town hall meetings were held in the churches, but also plays and concerts were held in the church, and it's still held in the church. When you talk about what we're currently holding in the church, those things are still there, which is pretty cool. But then also they talked about how that square in front of the church became kind of a market square. Not every merchant had a building, but they had a tent or a setup out there. Your fresh produce, your farm produce was sold out in that town square. That's part of that porch of the church. As well as your town festivals happened in that square. Everything kind of happened in the hub of the community, which was the church. Well, then you move into this country, and especially up in our area here, I think it'd be a different question if we lived in an older part of the United States. But we're very used to thinking about rural Minnesota, rural Dakotas, where these little towns, again, every little town had their church. And not only that, kind of like how around Bemidji we have all these town halls that are out in the community, they had churches just the same that served kind of that way out in the rural areas too, the country churches. But in those towns, nearly every town, after it kind of got going, one of the first buildings they built was the church. Because some of our ancestors brought their pastor from the mother country, and so that was one of the first things that got built before schools, before anything else. And those schools then happened in the church.
Sure.
And that's another piece of being a community center is, how many of our hospitals, our schools, our colleges started from the church, and maybe even started in the church. And then they got a separate building, and then as years went on, they became a separate entity. But the roots start in the church being the community center. Another thing I loved in the research I found, it was just the acknowledgement, and this was in a 19 26 publication out of a journal in Canada, but they said the church historically is one of those places that is like none other, that brings together the rich and the poor. Different nationalities are in this structure together. In that sense, it's not the club,
Right.
because clubs decide who they want to let in.
Right.
But the church is where the doctor sits next to the farmer.
Right.
And I've talked about that with communion, where enemies, families that are feuding, can kneel side by side at the altar, basically confessing their brokenness and receiving forgiveness together.
And I love that about the church and about the place of the church in this moment in time, when there's just so much divisiveness. We've talked a lot about that this past year, and yet somehow we're able to come to church and have meaningful conversations and figure out how we can still, as you said, sit side by side and come to the rail, because there are not many places where people are mixing that freely any longer. I was also thinking about how you were talking about the history when people first came to this country, and how, in a way, the churches also served as sort of cultural centers, because there would be a German church and a Norwegian church and a Swedish church, and how even to this day, we still tend to sort of be that hub for carrying on things like the Lutefisk dinner,
Yeah.
or the Santa Lucia festival, those kinds of things, how they have sort of gotten, we just have become a vehicle or a place where some of those things can continue to be carried on.
Yeah.
Um,
The last kind of piece about the historical church being a community center, again, center of the town, so the residential is all around it. The bells of the church did not serve the church alone, but oftentimes rang out on the hour, and rang out, of course, to announce worship, but then also were used as like our tornado sirens.
Yeah.
Or danger rings. When the church bells were ringing and it wasn't an hour and it wasn't worship time, you knew something else was happening.
Right. And I love how we brought that ancient practice back during this COVID year.
Yeah.
And started ringing it on a regular basis as a way to sort of sound out to the community that, we are here, God is present with us in the midst of this strange thing that we're all experiencing.
Yeah. So that's the ancient church. You were going to talk a little bit about...
Well, there's just so much I didn't even mention. I think you and I together have been kind of listing all the many ways that our church has become a center point for the community. And some of those have been in the traditional ways. The Santa Lucia, the Lutefisk, a place for, bridal showers and anniversaries. I got something in my throat. Why don't you list some of those? I'm going to grab a drink of water.
That is fine.
Here's my list.
Yeah. Well, I know that we talked historically about, this is before my time, but First Lutheran as the community gathering place, when the old fellowship hall used to be downstairs in the basement, I've seen video of the community table, which that's what it's currently called, being served downstairs to those who are hungry. And so that's one of the ones that currently isn't happening, but historically it has. As well, one of the ones that I'd thought of that, again, is historic but not current was First Lutheran oftentimes served as that gathering place for freshman orientation for Bemidji High School.
Yeah.
That they would use our education wing
Sure.
to kind of do that. And speaking of that, the old building over there, I believe you had said
Yes.
that your family came to early childhood family education, ECFE.
Yep.
And it was held in our building.
In our education wing. And so it became a very familiar place. The church was a very familiar part of our regular life, even though at the time we weren't necessarily members here.
I will say you were members of Calvary.
Right. Right.
And but yet this was a place that
Right.
was hospitable.
Right. And being located where we are in the community is such a beautiful thing, and I think continues to be an incredible gift that we are centrally located. And so we are easy to find. We are right down the road from the university, right down from Library Park, and I think that gives us a special sort of responsibility as well, to be true to our location in terms of using this space as hospitably as we can.
Yeah. It's been a joy to have Bemidji State University back here. Sarah and I talked a couple weeks ago. There's, back in our history, Bemidji State Teachers College choir sang in the sanctuary of First Lutheran. And now we've been enjoying that still. And being able to open up this particular part of our building to the community for the concerts that have happened has been a joy. But then we've got the other part of the building, which we've also been able to open. Lutheran Social Services does a lot of ministry pre-COVID out of that end of the building. And the auditorium, adopt a grandparent program, trainings. Most people don't probably realize this, but sometimes since I've been here, we hosted a special needs prom in the fellowship hall. And I just remember how excited they were and kind of how they decorated, and it was a joy.
Yeah, and we've opened our doors. We've had people come in to do Tai Chi, to walk the labyrinth. We've had a meditation group that brings in a diverse group of people, and I love how this space can be welcoming to such a variety of groups and people.
And I truly believe that letting people be comfortable in the church, because so many who are outside the church are kind of afraid of the building. They have no idea what goes on even in the building if they're not worshipers. Having Coach for the Community or events like that let people into the building and meet people in the building, I think serves our mission not only to help those who need help, but also to break down the barriers that sometimes church as club build up. And people don't feel welcome.
A couple of things. One, I think that it's really interesting to me that many people still see the church as a place of sanctuary, that we do have people come through our doors seeking help because they remember and think of the church as a place where you can receive help. And so even though we have Churches United and those kinds of organizations which are so important, I think there's something really valuable in sort of owning and honoring those people that do come seeking help, to do our best to help them as we can. I was also thinking in preparation for this conversation about how we like and talk often about church being home. This is our home church, our home congregation, and we talk about our church family and being a part of this congregational family, which is a beautiful thing. I mean, we want that, we long for that, we all need that. And at the very same time, that's different than being a church that is hospitable to the stranger. And so I think there's always a tension there between that sense of home, that we don't own this space, but that our calling as followers of Jesus are to always discern how we can welcome and stretch and grow and learn from others that are not like us. And I was thinking of Henry Nouwen, one of my favorite authors. He's a Catholic priest who talks about hospitality as creating a space where people can be fully who they are. So not the sense of having people come in to be like us,
to conform,
but to create a space where people can be themselves and explore what it means to have a relationship with Christ. I'll read the quote because I think it's really beautiful. He says, "Hospitality means primarily the creation of free space where the stranger can enter and become a friend instead of an enemy. Hospitality is not to change people, but to offer them space where change can take place. I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind as we think about what it means to be the body of Christ in this space and time.
Yeah. Our desire is to, and the reason that it's part of our vision for the congregation to be a community gathering place is partly our calling from Jesus to reach out, not to shelter in place,
Right.
as we have been, and unfortunately, we as a church, not First Lutheran only, but most churches are almost like a shelter in place mentality. But if you flip that open, the church as a place that is to serve.
I love the image of the Spirit blowing where it wills,
Mhm.
and rather than sheltering in place and being sort of locked down and huddled in, that it is a place where the windows and the doors are sort of blown open and we are sort of blown right out the door, and likewise have the fresh air of new people, new ideas, new energy coming in, and it's all circulating around and creating opportunities for we know not what, because we have a vision of where we believe God is calling us to be, but there's always surprise along the way of what we might be called to do or respond to next. And I
Yeah.
think that's part of the excitement of being a congregation.
Yeah, I think about the couple of conversations, and unfortunately, it's been several years now, and we need to be more attentive to this. And this is one of the other vision conversations we have. But the conversations that took place between the Native American community and the Christian community, but there were other religious communities that gathered around those tables when we had those conversations too. Was it the Baha'i?
Oh, yes, yes. And thank you for bringing that up, because that kind of goes with the hospitality piece, right? That in contrast, again, to being a place that is just home and family, that we are also by nature as Christians called to be in places that create discomfort, to be uncomfortable. And that's part of hospitality. And I was thinking that that's exactly one of those spaces where there were moments of uncomfortableness.
You bet.
And I'm so glad and grateful that we could host that, and I hope we do more of that in the future. But to host an interfaith dialogue, to have people come in that can share even hurts and pains or struggles they've had with the Christian church.
Correct, and that we, First Lutheran Church, was willing to be vulnerable enough to accept the criticism, you could say, because the church, for too long, and this is one of the biggest criticisms of people who are not part of the church or who have left the church, is that the Christian church always tries to cover up its blemishes and be perfect and be perfect people. And we know that none of us is perfect. We're all broken. And it's the reason we gather together is because we want to heal together. Yeah. And that's what the church is. The church isn't about being perfect. It's about being broken, but seeking to be healed.
Right.
And that's a message that I think we've lost over the past.
Yeah, I think that those are real challenges for us as we walk into the future and continue to struggle with how we can continue to be vulnerable in that way, because it's so easy to be defensive.
And so ideas and things that are kind of percolating right now, the expanding of the preschool into a child care center,
Right.
The continued use of the sanctuary for open to the public, free concerts and events. When we first moved here, and the children of the congregation were putting on the musicals that was fantastic, that whole idea
Yeah.
doesn't necessarily need to be a thing of the past.
Yeah.
But there are ways, partnering with Lutheran Social Services in the events that they're doing. I know that there's a lot more that we can do to be that community gathering place. And I know that for a while there was fear that red Jell-O might get spilled on the carpet. But then we pointed out that our carpet's red. And it really doesn't matter.
Yeah.
To have to replace carpet because it is overused. What a joy that would be.
Yeah.
Rather than it's so blooming dated
Right.
that we need to change the carpet.
Right.
Not that it's worn out. It's just really ugly.
Yeah.
So.
I
Well,
think, I was just going to
yeah.
say, I mean, there's so many more conversations that we'll have, and
Yep.
continue throughout this summer, and again, just lifting up a community called Grace, something to look forward to as we continue to evolve and figure out how to stretch and grow and include the younger people, the next generations.
Yeah. I don't believe, I don't know how far and wide that title has been spread. So it's like when you use acronyms or initials,
Right.
and people don't necessarily know. So a community called Grace is this worshiping community, this worshiping service that is seeking to reach out to our community, that Pastor Emily's kind of spearheading, that will be the fourth opportunity for our worship as members here too. So, we'll have our 8:30 or 8 o'clock and our 10:30 in the fall. We'll have our 6 o'clock in the evening on Wednesdays. And then we'll have this fourth opportunity, which is yet to be defined.
Yeah.
Kind of really seeking to reach those younger folks in the first third of life
Very exciting.
in worship. Yeah. Can we pray?
Yes.
Dear Lord, I give you thanks for the gift of this conversation. Lord, inspire us, excite us to open up this building, to serve your people. Lord, that is one thing that we often forget, is that we inside are not just your people, but the people outside this building are also your people. And we are to be a resource for your people. In Jesus Christ we pray. Amen.
Amen.